How can we sequester more carbon into our soils so that they are more productive, more profitable, and so they help mitigate the effects of drought and flooding? I'm Rob from Dowdle Family Farms, and over the last 10 or 12 years, I've tried a lot of different strategies to increase the organic matter in the soils of my gardens and on our pastures. Of all the different methods that I've tried, I break it down into two basic strategies. One of them is sequestering more carbon from the top down, and the other is sequestering carbon from the bottom up. In this video, we're going to talk about how we can sequester more carbon into our soils from the top down. Increasing the soil organic matter of our soils from the top down really revolves around top dressing our soils with something like a mulch, a compost, manure, or something along those lines. Top dressing is usually used to smaller plots of land because the materials to top dress are bulky and they're difficult to apply. So a lot of times people will put compost in their gardens or they'll put mulches in their flower beds or in the walkways of their gardens, and those are different types of top dressings. Occasionally you do see people top dressing their pastures or their agricultural fields. It most often occurs in the form of poultry litter, which is composted manure and bedding from poultry houses, but it also happens sometimes with manure from swine barns or many other practices. Sometimes people purchase compost to apply it to their fields, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But for the most part, this happens on a smaller scale just because the materials are so bulky. I find that there are usually four reasons that people top dress their fields or their pastures. The first one is because they're using it for the nutrients in the compost or the manure. That's usually what happens when people talk about applying poultry litter. They break down the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potassium amounts per ton, and then they apply it to their fields. And occasionally this will occur with compost as well, but usually it requires about 2 to 10 tons per acre of these materials applied to have much of an impact on them. The second reason people usually top dress their soils is because they're trying to inoculate them with something. A lot of times if you purchase a really good quality compost, I've heard that as little as 400 or 600 pounds can drastically increase the fungal components of the soil biology. It's more complicated than is necessary here, but soil biology is typically broken down into bacteria and fungi. A lot of times though, by applying small amounts of good quality compost can have a huge impact because it increases the fungal or bacterial components of their soil life depending on what they need. From what I understand, people also use compost teas and compost extracts for this reason as well, because they're trying to inoculate the soil with the preferred type of soil life they're trying to introduce. The third reason that I find that people usually top dress their soils is that they're trying to change their soil type. They may have a clay soil or a sandy soil, and they're really trying to increase the organic matter in that soil very quickly. A lot of times with raised beds, people will apply large amounts of compost or till it in. A lot of times manure or compost is tilled into soils, and even though that's mixing up the soil, usually that tillage does not go down 3 or 4 feet. The fourth reason people usually top dress their soils is they're trying to mulch it. It may be because they're trying to improve the water retention or to prevent weeds in their flower beds. Sometimes people will use mulches in the pathways in their gardens, but mulches are one of the more common ways people use to top dress their soils. Where I'm recording this video now, there was a house here one time. It was torn down, falling apart, but those steps over my right shoulder to your left are the steps that went up to the house. All of this area had a lot of gravel on it because it was parking lot, it was compacted, and it was really, really tough. About 6 years ago, we had several hundred loads of wood chips delivered to the property. And so we had a lot of excess, and so we put them out here under these magnolia trees and even further back all the way to the road. And you can tell now that the soil here is much darker, you don't see the gravel, and it has improved dramatically. If you top dress your soils, let me know in the comments what you do, how you do it, and why you do it. I'm kind of curious about that. There are a lot of different materials that people use to top dress their soils. We won't go into detail on any of them, but they vary from wood chips and pine straw, maybe in people's flower beds or garden beds. A lot of times people use compost or manures. Sometimes people will try things like biochar or mushroom compost. There's just a host of different things that people use to top dress their soils. So what have you used to top dress your soils? Let me know in the comments below. There are two main reasons that people may want to consider not top dressing their soils. First, the materials that we top dress our soils with tend to be very, very bulky and oftentimes heavy. Those heavy materials have to be trucked and hauled. Even if they're not heavy, they take a lot of volume. It's also labor intensive to put them out, but that is one negative component, is the time, energy, and the labor involved of applying these bulky materials. For me, the most negative part of top dressing our soils though, but as it breaks down, a small portion of that does go into the soil profile through the work of the soil microbes, earthworms, roots, and other things. However, a large portion of that carbon that sits on top of the soil goes back into the atmosphere. The researchers that I'm familiar with say that anywhere from 60 to 90% of the carbon in the stuff applied to the tops of soil goes back into the atmosphere. Now that in and of itself is not a huge negative component because it is part of the carbon cycle. Check out another video in this playlist if you want to hear about that. The reasons for top dressing our soils is it can be easier, at least in the short term, to spend that extra labor and time to put out those materials. Second, it can help inoculate the soil with a lot of soil life. Further, if we're applying manure or compost, it feeds the soil life and it feeds the plants, but we also sequester some carbon at the same time. And so the plants do get a lot of benefit out of top dressing our soils. It definitely has its place, but it's not all as perfect as we might assume it could be. If you're interested in how you can sequester more carbon into our soils and go deeper into the soil profile while doing that, check out our video on how we sequester more carbon in our soils from the bottom up. Until next time, it's Rob from Dowdle Family Farms wishing you the best. Take care. Have a great day.